The Zarkans had always believed that the galaxy operated within a set of predictable patterns. As a species with advanced technology and thousands of years of peaceful existence, they prided themselves on their ability to classify and categorize other civilizations. They had encountered scavengers, herbivores, even some rare predators, all neatly catalogued in their expansive archives. For the Zarkans, this was a peaceful endeavor, understanding and learning from others without conflict. That was until they encountered humans. At first, humans seemed like any other predatory species. Their adaptability was impressive, yes, but not unprecedented. Early observations showed a civilization that had mastered survival, colonized their own planet, and made tentative steps toward the stars. The Zarkans logged them under the predator category and moved on to further studies. But something about humans lingered in the minds of the Zarkan diplomats. There was a raw energy to them, an unpredictability that set them apart from other predator species. The Zarkans decided to observe more closely, and that's when they stumbled upon a group that seemed to defy all expectations: the Americans. The first real moment of shock came when the Zarkan diplomatic vessel stationed itself near an American military base. Their intent was peaceful observation, as it had been with countless other species. The Zarkans had strict rules against interference, content to watch from a distance, learning and recording without alerting the species to their presence. One morning, the Zarkans began to pick up strange movements near the base. Soldiers, thousands of them, moving with precision and speed. It wasn't an ordinary day for this base, that much was clear. The Zarkans observed through their cloaked vessel as the Americans began what they later learned was a routine military drill. What unfolded in front of their eyes was unlike anything the Zarkans had witnessed. The sheer coordination, the brutality of the simulated combat, the absolute control of the soldiers over every inch of the battlefield, it left the Zarkan observers stunned. These humans moved like predators, but there was something more. There was no hesitation, no moment of pause. They acted not just to survive but to dominate. Each movement calculated, each command executed with terrifying efficiency. One of the Zarkan diplomats, a seasoned observer of hundreds of species, turned to his colleagues and muttered, "These are not just predators. They are something far beyond that." There was a heavy silence on the observation deck as they watched the Americans complete their drill. It wasn't the violence that disturbed the Zarkans. They had seen violence in countless forms. It was the precision, the mastery over their environment, the complete and utter control that these humans displayed. It was clear that the Americans thrived in conflict, not just as a means to survive but as a way to assert their place at the top. The Zarkans, known for their peaceful diplomacy, found themselves unnerved. They had categorized humans as predators, but they now realized they had barely scratched the surface. These Americans, with their relentless drive and adaptability, were something else entirely, something more dangerous. The team retreated to their vessel to analyze what they had seen, reviewing footage and data. The debate among the diplomats was heated. Some argued that they should cease their study of humanity altogether, that this level of aggression could only lead to danger. Others insisted they continue. There was more to learn here, they argued. Humanity, especially these Americans, might hold secrets about survival and adaptation that the Zarkans could benefit from. After all, their study had always been about learning from other species, hadn't it? Despite the unease, curiosity won out. They would continue to observe. The Zarkans had witnessed enough to know that humanity deserved a closer look, especially these Americans. Their initial impressions had been shaken after the military drill, and now their curiosity grew. They began a deep dive into human history, focusing specifically on American culture. What they found both fascinated and unsettled them. Human history, in general, was a tale of survival, war, innovation, and constant evolution. But America's role in that history stood out like a beacon of dominance. From the Revolutionary War, where they defied a global empire, to the rapid technological advancements that propelled them into global leadership, Americans seemed to take every challenge as an opportunity to prove themselves stronger, faster, and more relentless than before. The Zarkans couldn't help but be impressed by their ability to adapt and overcome any obstacle. The concept of the American spirit, became a subject of fascination among the Zarkans. Independence, innovation, and an almost reckless sense of freedom seemed to define this group of humans. Whether it was the pioneers who crossed vast, dangerous landscapes to build new lives or the engineers who built machines to explore the moon, the Americans displayed a fierce need to push boundaries, break limitations, and rise above their circumstances. It wasn't just about survival for them, it was about conquest in all its forms, whether in warfare, economics, or space exploration. As the Zarkans analyzed further, they noticed an underlying pattern. In every era of American history, there was a drive that seemed uniquely intense compared to other nations. It wasn't just about fighting wars, though they certainly had a history of that. It was about reshaping the very world around them. Every major war or crisis seemed to fuel the nation's rise to greater power and influence, always pushing them toward the top. The Wild West, for example, was more than just a tale of survival. The Americans weren't just content to live, they had to conquer. The frontier wasn't something to coexist with but something to dominate, to control. It was this mindset, the Zarkans observed, that allowed them to thrive in even the harshest environments, making the impossible possible. Even more striking were the stories of American soldiers, particularly their elite forces. Navy SEALs, Delta Force, and others operated with a level of precision and expertise that rivaled anything the Zarkans had seen. These were not just humans, they were warriors shaped by an unforgiving culture that demanded victory at all costs. The Zarkans marveled at how these soldiers could enter a situation with seemingly insurmountable odds and come out victorious, time and again. This level of dominance wasn't limited to the battlefield, though. Economically, culturally, and technologically, America seemed to lead in ways that made other nations dependent on their innovations and systems. The Zarkans were struck by the sheer reach of American culture across the globe. From their films and music to their technology and ideals, American influence seemed to seep into every corner of the planet, creating an almost invisible empire. This, too, was a form of predation, subtle but effective. By spreading their culture and values, Americans didn't just survive, they controlled, dominated in ways that other humans could not. The Zarkans' earlier classifications of predator species felt inadequate. They had categorized predatory species before, but humans, and Americans in particular, operated on a different level. They didn't merely live within an ecosystem, they reshaped it, bent it to their will. The Zarkans had seen no other species, in their extensive galactic travels, that behaved in quite this way. This wasn't just survival. This was a deeply ingrained need to dominate in every possible way. Despite this admiration, there was a growing sense of unease among the Zarkan observers. They debated among themselves. Was this relentless drive a strength, or a danger? Would the Americans one day turn their predatory instincts outward, beyond Earth, and into the stars? If so, what would that mean for peaceful species like the Zarkans? Could they coexist with a civilization so determined to lead, to conquer, to stand at the top of the food chain? These questions gnawed at the Zarkan diplomatic team. Their fascination with American culture had grown into something more, a blend of awe and anxiety. Some among them argued that humans, especially the Americans, represented a new kind of galactic power, one that the Zarkans needed to understand and potentially align with. Others, however, cautioned that this unchecked aggression, this need to dominate, could pose a threat not just to their peaceful way of life but to the balance of power in the galaxy itself. As the Zarkans continued to study, it became clear that the Americans were unlike any species they had ever encountered. They were more than just survivors, they were apex predators. And that realization left the Zarkans with a difficult decision: to continue their peaceful observation or to prepare for a future in which they might have to confront this dangerous new force in the galaxy. The Zarkans thought they had time to understand humans better, to observe and learn before making any decisions. But that time was cut short when the Zorathans, a brutal and expansionist alien race, launched a surprise invasion into Zarkan space. The Zarkans, despite their technological superiority, were woefully unprepared for the kind of warfare the Zorathans brought with them. Their peaceful existence had left them vulnerable to an enemy that cared nothing for diplomacy or negotiation. The initial attacks were devastating. Entire cities were razed, and the Zarkan defense forces struggled to mount any kind of effective resistance. Their fleets, designed for exploration and peaceful engagement, were overwhelmed by the Zorathan warships, which were built for one purpose: total destruction. Within days, the Zarkans found themselves on the verge of annihilation. Desperate, the Zarkans reached out to other species for help, hoping that their alliances with other galactic civilizations would bring reinforcements. Some responded with offers of aid, but it was clear that no one was willing to face the full force of the Zorathan war machine. The Zarkans were on their own, until the humans answered the call. The Americans were the first to respond, and they did so with an efficiency that startled the Zarkan leadership. There was no hesitation, no long diplomatic deliberation. The American forces mobilized almost immediately, and it wasn't just a token gesture. They sent their best, the elite special forces that the Zarkans had already come to regard with a mixture of awe and fear. This was humanity's sharpest edge, and the Zarkans realized that their observations had only scratched the surface of what these humans were capable of. When the American forces arrived, the Zarkans were already in a state of chaos. The Zorathans had breached their planetary defenses, and it seemed only a matter of time before they overwhelmed the capital. The Americans, however, did not panic. They did not fall back or wait for reinforcements. Instead, they went on the offensive. The first strike was swift and brutal. American forces, equipped with advanced weapons and armor, dropped directly into the heart of the Zorathan invasion force. The Zarkans watched, astonished, as the humans tore through the enemy lines with an efficiency that was almost terrifying. The Americans fought like they had something to prove, like they had a personal vendetta against the Zorathans. But it wasn't just their combat prowess that stood out. It was their adaptability. The battlefield was constantly shifting, but the Americans shifted with it, always one step ahead of the Zorathans. Where the Zarkans had struggled to react to the enemy's strategies, the Americans anticipated them. They adapted, evolved, and outmaneuvered the Zorathans at every turn. It was as if the chaos of war fueled them, made them sharper, more focused. The Zarkans, still reeling from the initial invasion, were in awe. They had never seen anything like it. The Americans were relentless. They didn't just push the Zorathans back, they decimated them. Every time the Zorathans tried to regroup, the Americans were there, breaking their formations, cutting off their supply lines, and forcing them into retreat. The Zarkans realized that this wasn't just about defense. The Americans were taking the fight to the enemy, turning the invasion into a full-scale counteroffensive. In the span of days, the tide of the war had turned. The Zorathans, who had come to conquer, were now fleeing in disarray. And the Zarkans, who had once viewed the Americans with a mix of fear and caution, now saw them as their saviors. But even as the Zorathans were driven back, the Zarkans couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing something far more significant than just a military victory. The Americans didn't fight like any species the Zarkans had encountered before. They didn't just fight to win, they fought to dominate, to completely dismantle their enemies. And they did it with a cold, calculated precision that left the Zarkans both grateful and deeply uneasy. The war ended as quickly as it had begun. The Zorathans, humiliated and broken, retreated from Zarkan space, their invasion a complete failure. The Zarkans, who had been on the brink of extinction, were saved. And yet, as they celebrated their survival, they couldn't help but wonder what price they had paid. The Americans, for their part, showed little interest in the spoils of war. They didn't demand tribute or territory. They didn't seek to impose their will on the Zarkans. But their presence lingered. The Zarkan leaders knew that they had been given a glimpse of something powerful, something dangerous. The Americans had saved them, yes, but they had also shown them what true dominance looked like. In the aftermath of the war, the Zarkans held a private council. They debated what they had witnessed, what they had learned about the humans, and specifically, the Americans. Some argued that the Americans were a necessary force, a balancing power in the galaxy that could protect weaker species like the Zarkans from threats like the Zorathans. Others, however, were not so sure. They pointed out that the Americans had acted not just with strength, but with a kind of ruthless efficiency that bordered on terrifying. In the end, the Zarkans realized that they were dealing with something far beyond what they had anticipated. The humans, especially the Americans, were not just another predatory species. They were something else entirely. They were apex predators, the top of the food chain. And while they had saved the Zarkans this time, there was no telling what might happen if the Americans ever decided that the Zarkans themselves were an obstacle in their path. As the Zarkans prepared to resume their peaceful existence, they knew one thing for certain: the galaxy had changed. And at the center of that change stood the humans, with the Americans leading the charge, dominant, relentless, and impossible to ignore. The war was over, but the Zarkans couldn't shake the impact of what they had seen. The Americans had left as swiftly as they had arrived, their forces returning to Earth with little fanfare. There were no demands, no occupation, no sign of dominance beyond the battlefield. To the Zarkans, this was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire ordeal. The Americans hadn't sought power in the traditional sense, yet they had displayed a level of control over the situation that was undeniable. It left the Zarkans with much to reflect on. In the days following the conflict, the Zarkan Council convened to discuss what they had learned. The humans, and specifically the Americans, had shattered their long-held views on predator species. The Zarkans had believed that predators, by nature, were driven by survival, by the need to hunt, to consume, to expand. Yet the Americans had shown something different. They weren't just hunters. They didn't merely adapt to their environment, they shaped it to fit their needs. They didn't just survive, they conquered, and they did so with a kind of relentless efficiency that left the Zarkans questioning everything they thought they knew about predatory behavior. One of the council members spoke first, addressing the obvious question on everyone's mind: what exactly had they witnessed in the Americans? They had initially feared them as aggressive, dangerous, and unpredictable. Now, after seeing them in action, their view had changed, but not necessarily for the better. The Americans had saved the Zarkans from annihilation, but there was an unspoken tension in the room, a shared understanding that they had also been given a glimpse of a force far greater than they had ever anticipated. The debate that followed was intense. Some argued that the Americans had proven themselves allies, that their intervention had shown a willingness to protect and defend weaker civilizations. They pointed out that, despite their overwhelming power, the Americans had not exploited the Zarkans' vulnerability. They hadn't seized territory or imposed their will. In fact, they had asked for nothing in return. To many on the council, this was evidence of restraint, a sign that the Americans could be trusted, perhaps even relied upon in the future. But others were not so sure. They pointed to the way the Americans had fought, not just with strength, but with a kind of cold, calculated precision that bordered on ruthless. It was true that they hadn't claimed any material rewards, but the Zarkans couldn't ignore the way the Americans had dominated every aspect of the conflict. It wasn't just their military power that unsettled the Zarkans, it was the mindset behind it. The Americans hadn't fought out of necessity or desperation. They had fought as if victory was their birthright, as if failure was not even a consideration. One Zarkan philosopher raised a troubling point. We have seen the Americans in a moment of crisis, when they were needed. But what happens when there is no crisis? What happens when there are no enemies left to fight? Will they turn their attention outward to the stars? And if they do, what role will we play in their new order? This question hung heavy in the air. The Zarkans had always prided themselves on their peaceful nature, their ability to coexist with other species without resorting to violence or domination. But the Americans had shown them that peace, in the way the Zarkans understood it, was not always the natural state of things. The Americans existed in a world where power was not just a means of survival but a tool of influence, a way to shape the universe around them. As the council continued their deliberations, one thing became increasingly clear. The Americans were not like any other species the Zarkans had encountered. They didn't fit neatly into any of the categories the Zarkans had used to classify other civilizations. They were predators, yes, but they were more than that. They were apex predators, not because they were the most aggressive or the most violent, but because they were the most adaptable. They didn't just react to threats, they eliminated them. They didn't just respond to challenges, they redefined the rules of the game. In the end, the Council reached a reluctant consensus. The Americans, while dangerous, were not an immediate threat to the Zarkans. Their actions had been driven by necessity, and there was no evidence to suggest they harbored any ill will toward the Zarkan civilization. But there was also no denying the underlying truth: the Americans were now a dominant force in the galaxy, and any future dealings with them would have to account for that. The Zarkans knew that their place in the galaxy had changed. No longer could they rely solely on their technological advancements and diplomatic skills to ensure their safety. The Americans had shown them that power, in all its forms, was an essential part of survival. And while the Zarkans had always believed that cooperation and peace were the ultimate goals, they now understood that sometimes, strength was the only thing that kept those ideals intact. As the Council dispersed, the Zarkans were left with a new perspective on their place in the universe. The humans, particularly the Americans, had proven themselves to be more than just another species to observe. They were a force to be reckoned with, one that could not be ignored. The Zarkans had seen what happened when that force was unleashed, and while they were grateful for their survival, they were also left with an unsettling realization. The Americans were apex predators, not just in battle but in the very way they approached existence. They didn't seek power for power's sake. They sought it because it was the natural order of things for them to be at the top. And as the Zarkans prepared to return to their peaceful ways, they knew that the galaxy would never be the same. The Americans were out there, watching, waiting, and the Zarkans would never forget the day they learned just how dangerous a true apex predator could be.